The morning had been an ordinary one, which was precisely what made it unforgivable. Jasper Linton, Duke of Caverston, stood at the window of his dressing room with his back to the mirror and his jaw set against something he could not name. The argument had ended an hour ago. If it could be called an argument, Odette had not raised her voice. She had not wept. She had simply looked at him with those clear gray eyes and said, "I do not believe that is what you mean, Jasper." And he had found himself without a response that did not prove her right. He hated that. The precision of her. The way she could take his sharpest remark and turn it over in her hands like a stone she had found on a riverbank, examining it with curiosity rather than injury. He had married her because she was sensible. He had not anticipated that her sense would so frequently illuminate the absence of his own. The quarrel, if he were honest, and he was not yet prepared to be, had not been about the household accounts. It had not been about the letter from his mother, nor about the dinner invitation she had accepted on his behalf without consulting him. It had been about nothing, which meant it had been about everything, which meant it had been about the fact that he had returned from 3 days in London where he had sat in the House of Lords, listening to men talk about grain tariffs, while the woman he had married 7 months ago managed his estate with a competence that made his own steward redundant, and instead of being grateful, he was afraid. Afraid of what, precisely, he could not have articulated even under oath. Afraid, perhaps, that she had made herself essential. Afraid that the house ran better in his absence than in his presence. Afraid that the servants looked to her first and to him second, not out of disrespect, but out of something worse, preference. He turned from the window. The room smelled of shaving soap and the remains of the fire that had burned low in the grate overnight. His riding coat hung on the stand where Emery had placed it that morning, brushed and pressed as it had been every morning for 30 years. 30 years. Emery had been 29 when he entered the old Duke's service, and the old Duke had given him to Jasper on the boy's 20th birthday like a pocket watch or a good horse. Emery had dressed him for his first session in the Lords. Emery had stood in the corridor outside his father's bedroom the night the old Duke died and had said nothing except, "Your Grace," and in those 2 words had conveyed everything. The transfer of title, the weight of it, the expectation that Jasper would bear it as his father had. Emery had packed his trunk for his wedding and had unpacked it again in the rooms adjoining Odette's without comment, without expression, without anything other than the steady, impenetrable competence that Jasper had mistaken for devotion, and which he now understood was something more complicated. Emery. The valet appeared in the doorway as though he had been summoned by thought rather than voice. He was 60 years old and looked precisely as he had looked at 50, silver-haired, straight-backed, with hands that never trembled and eyes that never judged, at least not visibly. "Your Grace, I want her things removed from her rooms." The sentence hung in the air between them like smoke. Jasper had not planned to say it. He had been thinking it for the better part of an hour, not the words themselves, but the impulse behind them, the desire to do something, to make some gesture that would restore the balance he felt tilting away from him. He could not shout at Odette, because she would not shout back, and he would be left bellowing into a silence that made him monstrous. He could not leave the estate again, because he had only just returned, and even his pride had limits. He could not undo the argument, because he could not remember precisely what he had said, and therefore could not retract it. But he could move her things. He could have her belongings taken from the rooms adjoining his and placed in the east wing, the old family apartments that had not been properly aired in a decade. It was not a banishment. He told himself this even as the word formed in his mind. It was a rearrangement, a restoration of proper distance, a reminder that proximity was a privilege, not a right. Emery did not move. This was unusual only in its quality. Emery was a man of stillness by profession. A good valet does not fidget, does not shift, does not telegraph impatience or reluctance through the body. But this stillness was different. It was the stillness of a man who has heard something clearly and is choosing his response with the care of a surgeon selecting an instrument. "Her personal effects, Your Grace, her clothing, her books, all of it, everything, have it taken to the east wing before luncheon." "No, Your Grace." The word was so quiet that Jasper almost missed it. It arrived without emphasis, without defiance, without any of the theatrical weight that a refusal in a novel might carry. It was simply a word, a small word, 2 letters. And it detonated in the center of Jasper's chest like a musket ball. He turned slowly. Emery stood in the doorway with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture unchanged, his expression unchanged, his entire bearing so perfectly composed that for a moment Jasper wondered if he had imagined it. I beg your pardon? I said no, Your Grace. 30 years. Jasper's mind snagged on the number like fabric on a nail. 30 years of yes, Your Grace. 30 years of at once, Your Grace. 30 years of perfect, frictionless obedience that had made Emery not a person in Jasper's mind, but an extension of himself, a better dressed, more reliable extension that never lost its temper or said things it did not mean to women who did not deserve them. You are refusing me. I am, Your Grace. On what grounds? Emery was quiet for a moment, not hesitating. Jasper could see that. Choosing. There was a difference, and he had known Emery long enough to recognize it. On the grounds that I have served you for 30 years, Your Grace, and in that time I have carried out every instruction you have given me. I have polished boots that did not need polishing. I have pressed coats at midnight because you changed your mind about which one to wear. I have packed and unpacked your trunk 17 times for journeys you canceled at the last moment. I have done all of this without complaint because it is my duty and because— He paused. The pause was so brief that a lesser observer would have missed it. Because I have believed in 30 years that every instruction you gave was one you meant. And you believe I do not mean this. I believe you mean it at this moment, Your Grace. I do not believe you will mean it by this evening. The impertinence of it should have been staggering. A valet does not assess his master's emotional state. A valet does not predict his master's regrets. A valet fetches and carries and presses and brushes and keeps his observations locked behind a face trained from youth to reveal nothing. Emery was violating every principle of his profession and doing so with the calm of a man watering a garden. Jasper felt the anger rise. Hot, familiar, the same anger that had made him say whatever he had said to Odette that morning, the same anger that had pursued him from London, that had sat beside him in the carriage, that had followed him into his own home like a dog he could not shake. I am giving you an order, Emery. Yes, Your Grace. And you are refusing it. Yes, Your Grace. Then you may consider yourself dismissed. The words came out before he could stop them, and he heard them as though someone else had spoken them, heard the cruelty in them, the smallness, the pathetic reaching for authority by a man who had already lost it. Emery heard them too. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a fractional tightening of the shoulders, a minute adjustment that in another man would have been a flinch. Very well, Your Grace. He turned to leave. His movement was unhurried, precise, the movement of a man who had walked through that doorway 10,000 times and would walk through it now as he had always done, with dignity. And it was the dignity that stopped Jasper. Not his own conscience, which was slower and less reliable, but the sight of Emery's back, straight and silver-haired, and retreating with a grace that Jasper himself could not have managed under the same circumstances. Wait. Emery stopped. He did not turn. I did not. Jasper's voice caught on something that was not quite emotion and not quite pride. Stay where you are. Emery remained still. The corridor beyond the dressing room was quiet. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed 10. The sound traveled through the old walls of Caverstone Hall the way it had done for 100 years, thin, persistent, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding beneath it. Why? Jasper said. The word came out rough, stripped of its usual polish. Why this order? You have carried out worse. Emery turned then, slowly. His face was composed, but his eyes, Jasper noticed for perhaps the first time in 30 years, were not empty. They were simply private. There was a great deal behind them, held in reserve, and he was choosing now to let a fraction of it show. I have not, Your Grace. You have never given a worse order than this one. It is a domestic rearrangement. It is not, Your Grace, and you know it is not. The bluntness of it was like cold water. Jasper stood in his dressing room in his shirt sleeves, unshaved, unwashed, and for the first time in his adult life he felt the full weight of what it meant to be seen clearly by someone who had every reason to look away. You have served 3 Dukes of Caverstone, Jasper said quietly. 2, Your Grace, your father and yourself. And in all that time, Your Grace, I have never been asked to do something I believed would cause you lasting harm. The sentence settled between them like dust after a disturbance. Jasper stared at him. Emery met his gaze without defiance and without apology, simply with the steady, patient attention of a man who had spent 30 years watching another man become himself and who was not prepared to watch him become someone else. Jasper sat down. He sat in the chair where Emery shaved him each morning, the leather worn to softness by decades of use, and he put his hands on the armrests and he breathed. The anger was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer pointed outward, no longer searching for a target. It had turned inward, and what it found there was not rage, but shame, and the shame was worse because it was earned. "What did I say to her this morning?" he asked, and the question was not rhetorical. He genuinely could not remember. The anger had come first, and the words had followed it like sparks from a fire, and now the fire was dying, and he could not recall what had burned. Emery was silent. A valet hears everything and repeats nothing. This was not a rule Jasper needed to be reminded of. "She was in the garden," Emery said after a moment. "When I came through the corridor, she was speaking with Mrs. Wick about the linen stores." This was not an answer to the question, and Jasper understood immediately that it was not meant to be. It was a correction, not of his words, but of his attention. Odette was in the garden. She was discussing linen with the housekeeper. She was, at this very moment, doing what she did every day, managing the household that Jasper had given her and that she had made her own, unaware that her husband had spent the last hour trying to dismantle her presence in it. "You may go," Jasper said. "Your Grace." Emery withdrew. His footsteps in the corridor were measured, steady, the same rhythm they had kept for 30 years. Jasper listened to them fade, and then he was alone with the shaving soap and the dying fire and the knowledge of what he had nearly done. He did not move for a long time. The chair held him as it always had, neutral, patient, indifferent to whether the man sitting in it was a good one or not. He thought about the argument. He thought about the letter from his mother, which had said in its elegant, poisonous way that Odette was making too many changes to the household and that the servants were confused by having a mistress who involved herself in domestic matters rather than leaving them to the housekeeper as tradition demanded. He thought about the fact that his mother's complaint was not about tradition but about territory. Odette had taken something that the Dowager considered hers, and the Dowager had written to Jasper expecting him to take it back. And he had tried. Not consciously, not deliberately, but the letter had worked its way under his skin during 3 days in London, and by the time he returned to Caverstone, he had been carrying his mother's grievance like a stone in his pocket, mistaking its weight for his own. The argument with Odette had been the release. The order to Emery had been the escalation. And Emery, steady, silent, impeccable Emery, had done what no one else in Jasper's life had ever done. He had refused. Not to protect Odette, whom he had known for 7 months, not to defy Jasper, whom he had served for 30 years, but to protect something that existed between all three of them, a household, a marriage, a fragile architecture of trust that Jasper had been about to bring down with a single, stupid order. He stood. He did not go to the garden immediately. He went first to the library, because the library was where he went when he did not know what else to do, and because the library did not require anything of him, not conversation, not decisions, not the particular effort of being looked at by someone who could see him clearly. The room was cool. The curtains had not yet been drawn back, and the September light came through them in long amber bars that fell across the carpet and the desk and the spine of a book he had left open 3 nights ago and not returned to. He sat in the chair by the window, not his father's chair, which still stood by the hearth and which Jasper had never been able to bring himself to move, and he looked at the shelves. His father had been a difficult man, not cruel, not cold, but armored in a way that made proximity feel like a negotiation. The old Duke had loved his wife, Jasper's mother, in the way that men of his generation loved, privately, incompletely, with a devotion that expressed itself through provision rather than presence. He had given her a house, a title, a staff, an income, and precisely none of the companionship she had wanted, and she had responded by becoming the kind of woman who needed none of it. Brittle, self-sufficient, magnificent, and entirely alone. Jasper had watched this. He had grown up inside it, absorbing its lessons without realizing he was learning anything. And now, sitting in the library of the house his father had built around a marriage he had never quite managed to inhabit, Jasper understood with terrible clarity what he had been doing that morning. He had not been punishing Odette. He had been becoming his father, using distance as a tool, using servants as intermediaries, using the architecture of the household itself to avoid the simple, devastating act of sitting in a room with a woman and allowing her to matter. Emery had seen it. Of course Emery had seen it. He had served the old Duke. He had watched the first marriage calcify into formality, had pressed the old Duke's coats and brushed the old Duke's boots, and stood in the corridor while the old Duke ate alone in his study, and the Duchess ate alone in her rooms, and the house grew quieter year by year, until silence was not a symptom but a condition. And when Jasper had given the order, "Remove her things," Emery had heard the echo, not of Jasper's voice, but of his father's. The same impulse, the same retreat, the same slow, cowardly dismantling of a marriage through the accumulation of small cruelties, that no single one of which seemed large enough to name. The library clock ticked. A bird called outside the window, a thrush, high and clear, repeating its phrase with the insistence of a creature that had only one thing to say and intended to say it until it was heard. Jasper stood again. He washed his face in the basin in his dressing room. He dressed himself, badly, without Emery's help, his cravat crooked and his waistcoat buttoned wrong, and he went downstairs. The house was quiet in the way that Caverston was always quiet in the mornings, not empty but held, as though the walls themselves were waiting for the day to declare its intentions. He passed through the entrance hall, past the portraits of his father and grandfather, past the library where he had spent the previous evening pretending to read while the anger built, and out through the garden door. She was there. Odette stood at the edge of the kitchen garden with Mrs. Wick beside her, examining a row of herbs that had been planted the previous month. She wore a dress the color of warm honey, muslin, high-waisted, with a Spencer jacket in pale blue that caught the September light. Her hair was pinned loosely, and a strand of it had come free at her temple, and she was pushing it back with her wrist because her hands were full of something. A sprig of rosemary, he saw as he came closer, which she was holding up to the light as though it were a document requiring close reading. She did not see him immediately. "Mrs. Wick did." The housekeeper's eyes flickered to him and then away, trained by years of service to acknowledge without interrupting. But Odette was absorbed in whatever she was saying about the rosemary, her voice low and animated, her face alive with the kind of focused pleasure that Jasper had come to recognize as the expression she wore when she was doing something she considered useful. He stopped at the edge of the path. He did not call to her. He simply stood and waited and watched the woman he had married 7 months ago hold a sprig of rosemary up to the morning sun while the household she had made her own went on around her, oblivious to how close it had come to being different. She turned and saw him. Her expression shifted, not to wariness, not to resentment, not to any of the things he deserved. She looked surprised and then, almost immediately, something softer, something that looked like relief. "Jasper," he walked to her. The path was gravel, and his boots crunched on it, and the sound was ordinary and real, and he was grateful for its ordinariness. "What are you looking at?" he said. She held up the rosemary. "Mrs. Wick says this variety will not survive the winter, but I disagree. The roots are deep enough." He looked at the rosemary. He looked at her hand, which was bare. She had taken her gloves off to work in the garden, and her fingers were stained faintly green, and her wedding ring caught the light. "May I sit with you?" he said. She studied his face. He did not know what she found there, the remains of the anger perhaps, or the new thing that had replaced it, the thing that did not have a name yet but that felt like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. "Of course," she said, and then, with the precision that he had married her for and that he was only now learning to deserve, "There is a bench by the wall. It is warmer there." He sat. She sat beside him. Mrs. Wick had vanished, dissolved into the house with the particular skill of a servant who knows when to be absent, and they were alone in the garden with the herbs and the September light and the silence that stretched between them, not empty but full, waiting to be filled with whatever came next. He did not explain. He could not have explained without confessing, and he was not yet ready for the shape that confession would take, the words too ugly, the impulse too small, the damage too nearly done. But he sat beside her, and when she returned to her examination of the rosemary, pointing out where the new growth had thickened at the base, he listened. He listened with the attention of a man who has just learned, from the quietest possible source, what it costs to stop listening. "You're wearing your waistcoat wrong," she said after a while, without looking up from the herbs. He glanced down. The buttons were misaligned by one, the second fastened into the third hole, the rest following an error down to the hem. He had dressed himself. The evidence was conclusive. "I dressed in haste," he said. She looked at him then, and her mouth curved, not quite a smile, not quite amusement, but something adjacent to both that contained, in its slight asymmetry, a knowledge of him that he had not given her permission to acquire and could not now take back. "I can see that," she said. They sat together until the sun moved past the garden wall and the warmth shifted to the east side of the house. She told him about the linen stores, which needed restocking, and about Pharaoh's report on the tenant farms, which was overdue, and about a letter from her sister in Devonshire, which was mostly gossip but contained a useful observation about the price of wool. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not redirect the conversation to himself. He sat on the bench by the garden wall, and he let his wife tell him about the world she had built inside his household, and he recognized, with a clarity that hurt, that the world she had built was better than the one he had maintained alone. That evening, Emery appeared at the dressing-room door at the usual hour. He carried Jasper's evening coat over his arm, pressed and brushed as it always was, and his expression was exactly what it had been every evening for 30 years, composed, professional, attentive, and entirely free of triumph. "Your Grace." "Emery." The valet crossed the room and laid the coat on the stand. He began setting out the evening clothes, shirt, cravat, waistcoat, stockings, with the unhurried precision that was not efficiency but ritual, the daily performance of a duty that had long since become something closer to devotion. Jasper stood still and let himself be dressed. The cravat was tied correctly. The waistcoat was buttoned in sequence. The coat was settled onto his shoulders with a single practiced movement that Emery had performed 10,000 times, and that felt, tonight, like an act of restoration. Neither of them mentioned what had happened that morning. Neither of them would, not that day, and not any day after. It existed between them the way certain things exist between two people who have known each other long enough to accumulate a private history, not spoken, not forgotten, simply held. A refusal that had saved something. A silence that contained more than most conversations. Jasper looked at himself in the mirror. He looked like the Duke of Caverstone. He looked like a man who had been properly dressed by a valet who had served him for 30 years. "Thank you, Emery," he said. "Your Grace." The words were the same words they had exchanged every evening, but they were not the same. They both knew it, and knowing it was enough. The months that followed were not dramatic in the way that stories suggest transformations must be. There was no grand gesture, no public declaration, no single moment when the household could point and say, "There, that is when it changed." But it changed. Slowly, in the way that seasons turn, not all at once, but through the accumulation of small shifts that are only visible in retrospect. Jasper began appearing at breakfast with Odette rather than taking his meal in his study. He asked Pharaoh for reports that he had previously ignored, and he read them. And when Odette offered observations about the tenants or the harvest or the drainage on the lower fields, he listened with the particular attention of a man who has learned that listening is not a concession but a skill, and that the woman sitting across from him at breakfast had been practicing it longer than he had. He wrote to his mother. The letter was brief and contained in its 2 short paragraphs a message that the dowager would recognize for what it was. The borders of Caverstone had been drawn, and Odette was inside them, and interference from outside would not be tolerated. He did not show the letter to Odette. She did not need to know that the battle had been fought, only that it was over. Emery continued, as he always had, pressing, brushing, packing, unpacking, arriving at doors before he was summoned, and departing before he was dismissed. But there was a change in the texture of the silence between him and Jasper, a loosening, as though a rope that had been pulled taut for 30 years had been given a fraction more slack. Jasper began saying good morning to him. Emery began occasionally to reply with something other than "Your Grace," a remark about the weather, a mention that the tailor's delivery had arrived, a quiet observation that the new riding boots were wearing well, small things. The vocabulary of 2 men learning, after 3 decades, to occupy the same room as equals in the only way their respective positions would allow. Bess noticed the change before anyone else in the household. She was Odette's lady's maid, young, attentive, devoted to her mistress with the fierce loyalty of a woman who had been hired from a draper's shop in Carlisle and given a position she had never dared imagine. Bess noticed that the Duke had begun leaving his study door open in the afternoons so that Odette could call through to him when something required his attention. She noticed that he had moved a second chair to the window in the drawing room, angled toward the first so that when they sat together in the evenings, the space between them was companionable rather than formal. She noticed that when Odette laughed, which she did more often now. The Duke's expression changed in a way that Bess could not have described, but which she recognized instinctively as the look of a man surprised by his own happiness. Bess said nothing about any of this. She was a lady's maid, and ladies' maids, like valets, are trained in the art of observation without commentary. But she was glad of it. She had feared in the early months that the Duke would prove to be the kind of husband who treated his wife as furniture, present, functional, and beneath notice. She had been wrong. He was the kind of husband who had almost treated his wife as furniture and had been stopped by something Bess did not know about and would never learn at the last possible moment. Odette, who noticed most things, noticed the changes too. She said nothing about them. She had learned, in her time as Duchess, that some changes in a household are best left unexamined, not because they are fragile, but because naming them would diminish them, would reduce them from lived experience to anecdote. And she had no interest in anecdotes. She had an interest in the household working well, and it was working well. And that was enough. 3 years later, on a morning in late November, Emery appeared in the dressing room and informed the Duke that he intended to retire at the end of the year. He was 63. His hands, which had never trembled, had begun to ache in the cold, and he could no longer manage the small buttons on the Duke's evening waistcoats with the precision he considered acceptable. Jasper received this news with the particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow he had known was coming and had refused to prepare for. "You are certain?" "I am, Your Grace. And if I were to say that precision with waistcoat buttons is not a requirement I insist upon, then I would say, with respect, that it is a requirement I insist upon, and that a valet who cannot dress his master properly is no valet at all." Jasper looked at him for a long moment. Emery looked back. They were two men in a dressing room that smelled of shaving soap and cedar, surrounded by 33 years of accumulated routine, and the silence between them was the kind that only exists between people who have seen each other clearly and have chosen, despite what they saw, to remain. "Very well," Jasper said. "What will you need?" Emery retired in January with a full pension, a cottage on the Caverstone estate, and a letter of commendation written in the Duke's own hand. The letter was 3 pages long. It did not mention a morning in September. It did not need to. Jasper kept the draft in his desk drawer. He did not file it with the household papers. He did not show it to Pharaoh or Mrs. Wick. He simply kept it, the way a man keeps a document that matters more than its words, a reminder of what had almost happened and of the man who had stood in a doorway and, with 2 letters, prevented it. Odette found the draft 5 years later, on a winter afternoon when she was looking for sealing wax in Jasper's desk. She read it standing by the window, the light falling across the page, and when she finished, she stood very still for a long time. She did not ask Jasper about it. She did not mention it to Mrs. Wick or to Bess, who had been her lady's maid for 12 years and who would have wept at the contents. She simply folded the letter, replaced it in the drawer, and went downstairs to the kitchen, where she asked the cook to prepare Emery's favorite pudding for the parcel they sent to his cottage each week. That evening, at dinner, Jasper noticed that the pudding on the table was different from the one he had expected. He looked at Odette. She looked back at him with those clear gray eyes, the same eyes that had looked at him on a September morning 7 years ago and said, "I do not believe that is what you mean, Jasper." And her expression contained something new, not accusation, not hurt, not even surprise, something quieter, something that looked in the candlelight like understanding. "The rosemary is still growing," she said. "Mrs. Wick owes me a shilling." He laughed. It came out rough, unexpected, the sound of a man who had been carrying something for 7 years and had just felt it shift, not disappear, but settle into a place where it could be borne. "She will never pay it," he said. "No," Odette agreed, "but she knows she owes it. That is sufficient." They sat together at the long table in the dining room of Caverstone Hall, the candles burning steadily in their sconces, the hearth glowing behind the grate, and the house around them holding its breath the way old houses do, not waiting for drama, but for the quiet, unremarkable continuation of life lived well inside walls that have seen enough to know the difference. And in a cottage at the edge of the estate, Emery sat by his own fire and ate the pudding that had arrived that afternoon without explanation. He did not require one. He had spent 33 years in a household that communicated through gesture and silence and the precise placement of objects, and he understood what the pudding meant the same way he had understood on a September morning long ago what an order to remove a woman's things had meant. He had said no, It was, he reflected as the fire crackled and the November wind pressed against the windows, the finest thing he had ever done. Not because it was brave, though it was, in the small, uncelebrated way that most true bravery is, but because it was correct. He had served the Duke faithfully for 30 years, and on the 31st year he had served him more faithfully still, by refusing to let him become a man who deserved to be refused. The fire burned low. Emery washed his plate and set it on the shelf. He checked the latch on the door and the damper on the hearth, as he had done every night for 3 years in this cottage and for 30 before that in the great house, and he went to bed. Outside, the estate slept. The gardens where Odette had once held Rosemary up to the light were dark now, the herbs dormant beneath their winter mulch, the roots deep and patient and waiting, as roots do, for the season to turn. They arrive here, like a man who stops in a corridor and finds he cannot take another step in the wrong direction, not because someone stopped him, but because he finally stopped himself whenever they are ready.